question, can you hear? Yes? Okay. And I know, apologies to our friends in the hallway. This will be on Zoom and recorded, so you can come back and make sure that you got it all right. Anyway, thank you very much for being here. My name is Mary Eintema. I'm the president of World Boston, and this flight is Chat and Chowder with Joseph Nye, discussing his book, A Life in the American Century, which is such a thrill to say and to experience. I'm just going to be very brief here. First of all, I have to say, as you may know, the mission of World Boston is to foster international engagement and global cooperation, which seem like very good ideas right now. And so we thank you for doing this mission with us. Right off, we have to thank the Pardee School for sharing this beautiful venue, and the Pardee Center for the Study of a Longer Range Future for being our event partner. So you can't get anywhere in this world without friends. We're very grateful to our friends. I shout out my good colleague, Harrison Zyberg, who is managing tonight's event, and my other World Boston colleagues. We also thank the Lowell Institute, which supports our Chat and Chowder and Great Decision series, as well as our annual State Department program. The Lowell Institute makes it possible for these events to be free for all attendees, which is really something. But free of charge does not mean free of cost. You may have seen these buttons last year, but 2025 is the blue year. So if you don't have a blue one yet, you better get one, and we're very grateful. So you can make a tax-deductible contribution to World Boston at this attractive QR code or on our website anytime. Quickly, upcoming events. We're going to be back at BU next week. We'll host our Great Decisions installment on science across borders. Very interesting program with the president of the Museum of Science, Tim Ritchie. That's going to be at the CDS Conference Center, also on the BU campus. So check the website to make sure that you're in the right place. February 11th, let's have some fun. It is our beloved annual International Affairs Book Swap. I know you have some extra books. Not this one that we're talking about tonight. Bring your books, swap them out for ones you haven't read yet, and do some networking, and please join in. You can learn more and register for all of our upcoming programs, which are always being added to at worldboston.org. Finally, a note on housekeeping. First of all, you may see me using my phone. I apologize. It's how I'm keeping in touch with my colleagues. And then when we get to audience Q&A, many of you may know the way that we do it at World Boston is I'll call on you, a colleague will bring you a mic, and then you ask a question that ends in a question mark, and we'll be glad to have them. If you're on Zoom right now, welcome. Your questions should go into the Zoom Q&A box. Don't look for the chat function because we don't have one on this Zoom. So right now, I'm very happy to turn it over to our friend, Ambassador Jorge Jaime, to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mary, dear friends. Thank you for joining us here at the Pardee School.
You should be on.
Center. It is, of course, a very special privilege once again to join forces with World Boston to co-host an event, as we have been doing for the past couple of years. And there is no better way to start the spring term. Classes started yesterday, then with the presence of Professor Nye and his latest book. And our next event of the Pardee Center will be on February 6th. The Boston launch of a new report by the Quincy Institute toward a new security order, a seminal study to which you are all cordially invited and for which flyers are available at the entrance. At this venue and with this public, Professor Joseph Nye needs no introduction. So let me just say this. Professor Joseph Nye is University Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus and former Dean of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He has served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Chair of the National Intelligence Council, and as Deputy Undersecretary of State. He personifies at its best the notion of the scholar practitioner, as we were talking earlier, one so dear to the Pardee School of Global Studies, where we aim to bridge the gap between theory and praxis in international affairs. He is also a prominent public intellectual, publishing regular columns in Project Syndicate and other outlets that have a significant impact. He recently published one on the BRICS, an entity on which we have a slightly different take, but his columns are very widely read and very influential. Professor Nye's extensive body of work across many books has been highly influential, and the concept of soft power, which he coined, has become a key part of the vocabulary of the discipline of international relations. A recent survey ranked him as the most influential scholar on American foreign policy. That said, I would like to make a case that as much as his name is associated with the concept of soft power, one of Professor Nye's very first books, Power and Interdependence, World Politics in Transition, was as significant for the evolution of the field of international relations as far back as the 1970s, as his more recent ones. It was one of the very first books I read in my doctoral studies at Stanford as a student of Professor Nye's co-author, Robert Cohen, with whom he continues to be very much in touch. And it is a book that is mandatory reading for my students to this day, providing us with new lenses to understand the changing nature of international relations in our time. Now, it's interesting to note that as a rule, political scientists in particular and scholars in general are not very prone to write memoirs. And there's a good reason for that, you know. It's difficult to craft a fascinating narrative from a life spent in offices writing books. So we are very privileged to have this memoir, which doesn't dwell only on some fascinating stories in Washington and in Cambridge, but also from the wider world, from Africa, from Central America, from Asia. You should read it. It's not very long, which is an added bonus. So, once again, a real privilege to have you here, Professor Nye. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jorge. Well, yes, read the book. It's an entertaining read. That is not always the case with the books that come across one's desk, but it's entertaining and also a wonderful first-person history of very major events and seemingly accounts of all the major people that one can think of. I think many of us are intensely aware that 2 days ago, we saw the inauguration of the 47th President of the United States in a peaceful transfer of power, which in itself is an achievement. So today, how do you see the American century 2 days into our current presidency? And maybe along the way, you could mention to folks, remind us what the American century is and how it came to title this book.
Well, the term, the American century, was invented by Henry Luce, who was the publisher of Time Life. And he actually used this phrase and published it in, I think it was March of 1941. And at that time, the United States was very isolationist. Remember, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was in December. And Luce wanted to persuade the American people that they had to live up to their responsibilities as becoming one of the most powerful countries in the world. He had no effect at all. The Japanese did. Franklin Roosevelt had been trying to persuade the Americans to follow Luce's advice, but with not very much luck. And then after Pearl Harbor, the Americans obviously became very involved. And by the end of World War II, the United States represented half of the world's economy. That's partly because other countries had been destroyed and we had been bolstered by the war. But even with the period of what you might call natural decline from 50% of the world economy to about 25% by 1970, we've stayed pretty much the same. We're about 25% of the world economy today. And so if you were to chart this on a graph, the U.S. has gone like that, and then big plateau. So if the argument is that for the American century is that if the largest country in the world doesn't chip in to try to produce global public goods, nobody else will. Everybody else will be a free rider. And that is basically the concept of the American century. Now, to go to your point of bringing this up to date, it's not clear what's going to happen to this. People talk about American decline, and decline is a very ambiguous word. It depends, decline compared to what? As I showed with this imaginary graph, we haven't been declining. We've declined since 45. We haven't been declining since 70, as measured by GDP. On the other hand, in terms of American ability to attract other people, which is what I call soft power, it goes like this. It's cyclical. And in the Cold War, we're quite attractive. In the period in Vietnam, we become very unattractive. Then we regain our attractiveness in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s. And then we lose it again with the invasion of Iraq. We regain it with the election of Obama, and lose it again with the first election of Trump. Regain it somewhat under Biden. So, I've taken economic measures because I can quantify them, and I've taken public opinion polls since I can quantify that. And what it shows is that economically, we go like that and then flat. With our soft power, we oscillate. It's like waves. And I would predict that what we're going to see is a downturn. If your slogan is America first, it means everybody else is second or later or last. And that's not a great way to attract others. So I think and what's more, if you start your inaugural week with talking about regaining the Panama Canal by force, renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, and taking Greenland, it's not exactly the right way to attract other countries. I had a Danish student who came in to see me today. He said, "Is he really serious about this?" It's caused enormous fear in Denmark. Denmark's one of our closest allies. And the idea that whether this is a serious remark or an offhand remark to stir up his base, who knows? But it's not the way to establish American soft power. So I end the memoir by wrestling with this question, and I say that I end it with what I call a faint ray of guarded optimism, which is a way. I think our institutions are such that we will come through this as we've come through crises in the past. After all, in the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt thought that democracy might be finished in the United States. And in the 1960s, you had cities on fire and mass riots and so forth. So we've had some pretty bad spells. I think the next 4 years are going to be a very difficult spell. I suspect in 4 years' time we'll still have a ship to sail, but it'll need some repairs.
Thank you. I think we actually heard him say manifest destiny. Isn't
Oh,
that
I
right?
missed that.
I believe he said that, which is interesting vis-a-vis engaging with another member of NATO,
Right.
with an ally. But we shall see. So it really is, although a brief and entertaining book, very comprehensive of many things. So I'm just going to pick up a couple of items and themes that you mentioned, and if I'm clearly missing something, let me know. You have thought many things, written many things, created many important concepts, and also done many things. One of your first tours in government was working on non-proliferation, which many of us remember as absolutely critical. We thought about nuclear weapons a lot. What was the result of that work, and how do you feel about nuclear security now?
Well, when I was asked to join the Carter administration I started in January '77, and at that time the widespread view was that nuclear weapons were going to increase, the number of countries were going to increase rapidly. In fact, John F. Kennedy, when he was speculating about the number of countries with nuclear weapons, said that by the 70s there would be 20 to 25. Today there are 9. When I came into the Carter administration, the view was that it was going to rapidly increase because you'd had the great oil crisis of 1973, 74, where the Arab oil embargo on the U.S. and other states led to a quadrupling of the price of oil. And that led to everybody saying, well, we're going to have to go nuclear. And if we're all going to go nuclear, 600 reactors was a number that was tossed around. There's not enough uranium. So if there's not enough uranium, we'll have to use plutonium, which is a byproduct of nuclear fission. And the trouble is plutonium is a weapons-usable material. And so the view was that it was just in the nature of things that we're going to see a lot more countries with nuclear weapons. The main thing I think that Carter did was put this as a very high priority. And we did a couple of things. One was to take a couple of deals. The Europeans had made deals with Pakistan to provide them with, the French had done a plant to reprocess nuclear waste and produce plutonium, and the Germans had provided Brazil, or were providing Brazil with a plant to enrich uranium, which could make it highly enriched, which is weapons usable. And the Italians were thinking or beginning to talk with the Argentines about something similar. And the feeling was that we had to stop these plans before they went to full fruition, or you'd never see the end of it. And so Carter spent a fair degree of his political capital on that. The other thing, though, was to try to knock on the head this idea that that we were all moving toward a plutonium economy, and this was in the nature of things. So we started an international nuclear fuel cycle evaluation, which had about 40 countries that had significant nuclear energy facilities. And we did studies about how much uranium is there. Is it really that short? And do we know enough about how to safeguard plutonium so that it isn't misused? And so we spent 2 years on these studies, which didn't solve the problem, but did stop this view that this was the inevitable wave of the future. And I think the Carter administration was able to slow the rate of change, and it was, it wasn't perfect, but it shaped the curve, if you want.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll just tell you one quick anecdote, rather than all these dull statistics, to illustrate what the diplomacy was like. When we were trying to dissuade the French from finishing their nuclear reprocessing plant with Pakistan, I went to Paris and had a full day's negotiations in this fuel cycle evaluation, and it was exhausting. I mean, the French Undersecretary of Foreign Affairs, who had to chair the meeting, had a particularly hard time, but I had gotten authorization to declassify some information to present to the French. The French had said this plant is purely for peaceful purposes, and the Pakistanis are just using it for peaceful purposes, and the French wanted to believe that because they had a reprocessing plant at La Hague, and they were delighted at the idea that they could sell a lot of copies of it. And we at American intelligence had discovered that the Pakistanis were actually doing experiments with implosion technology, which is taking conventional explosives and using to push the plutonium into a critical mass, which then explodes into a nuclear explosion. And you don't do that for peaceful purposes. And so I got permission to expose this to the French. And so I asked this undersecretary if we could go in a corner of this large conference area. I'd like to share something with him. And I had somebody who had a locked briefcase who opens it up and gives me the documents to show to the French man. And he looks at this, and he spent all day saying how this is peaceful. And I present him with this evidence that it's being used to make a weapon, and he keels over. I mean, he was exhausted, but I thought, oh my God, I've killed him. And he was just exhausted in the idea that his argument that he spent all this time investing in was useless. That was too much for him. And then another Frenchman, André Giraud, who became their Minister of Defense eventually, who was then head of their Atomic Energy Commission, took his place and looked at these documents, and he said, if this is true, we're going to have to change our position. But if you leak any of this to the press, we won't. That was a real challenge. And yet we were able to keep it quiet. And finally, by November, this would probably be about June that I was in Paris doing this. By November, the French sent us a telegram, diplomatic telegram, saying they had told the Pakistanis that there were technical difficulties that had arisen with the front end of the plant, which would delay its completion. So it never was completed. But that's a diplomatic anecdote. which is more interesting than all those numbers.
So it's the moral for quiet diplomacy. You should first attempt to kill your interlocutor. Is that-
If I were smarter, I would have found a better way of presenting it to him.
But he survived.
Yeah.
And then we go into a golden age, really, of arms control in managing the bomb, the ABM, Treaty INF, START, et cetera. Is there a future now for continued arms control, for continued restraint on the development and use of nuclear weapons?
Well, it's getting worse. I
Yep.
mean, we're down to one treaty, which is the U.S.-Russian Treaty on Strategic Weapons, but that is supposed to expire next year, and if you look at U.S.-Russian relations, there doesn't seem to be much inclination toward renegotiating it for extension. So in terms of maintaining control of the number of weapons between the large powers doesn't look promising, and China, which is increasing its nuclear arsenal quite rapidly after years of not doing so, doesn't want to talk about arms control. So that aspect of it, I think, is in bad shape. On the other hand, the Non-Proliferation Treaty still exists, and as I said, the number of states, there are 5 states that had declared nuclear weapons by 1968 when the treaty was signed, and today there are 4 more, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. Well, compared to Kennedy's prediction, that's not too bad. The question, I think, is will the Non-Proliferation Treaty survive? There's also the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which prevents atmospheric nuclear tests. And that seems to be surviving, though some people have talked about the need to have tests again above ground to be able to test out a new range of nuclear weapons. So it's a mixed bag. On arms control between the U.S. and the Russians and Chinese, it's not encouraging.
Right.
On the non-proliferation and test ban side, it's still holding.
So, thank you. I'm going to blast through decades and a lot of incredible work and scholarship and thinking to park for a moment at the notion of power and interdependence, which obviously Ambassador Heine mentioned. And you, along with Robert Cohen, almost branded the notion of neoliberalism, interdependence. Doesn't it seem, as we look around today, obviously I'm playing devil's advocate, that increasingly might makes right? And so how is this international cooperation thing, achieving goods together, goods for states and non-state actors as opposed to individually, how is it looking when invasions are happening right and left, treaties being violated?
Yeah. When we wrote Power and Interdependence, which was published in '77, I guess, we were not arguing that the world was becoming peaceful because of trade. There is that view. We were saying that as countries develop more interdependence, they can use it for power purposes. So if I depend on you, and you depend on me, but you depend upon me more than I depend on you, I have power over you. So what we wrote was the detailed examination of how that plays out in international politics. We pointed out that sometimes when sets of countries become heavily interdependent and develop institutions for cooperation, you reduce this manipulation of power or of interdependence to reduce power. And the European Union would be a good example of that. I mean, and that makes a big difference in world politics. If you compare Europe in the let's say the 1890s or before 1914, they had, 3 wars between Germany and France between 1870 and 1939, big wars. And if you look at German-French relations today, there can be diplomatic disputes between Paris and Berlin, but the idea of war is just out of the question. Nobody would even think about it. And that's a case of institutionalized interdependence. So it works in some areas and not in others. There was a hope that that the U.S.-Chinese trade relations and interdependence would produce something like that, but it didn't.
Right.
And so when I was in the Clinton administration, responsible for defense in East Asia, and faced with the rise in the power of China, we had a mixed strategy. We said the first thing we have to do with the rise of China is to get the balance of power straight. That's a very realist proposition, which means that we have to reaffirm the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, which in '93 most people thought was a relic of the Cold War and should be abandoned. And our view was if you had 3 major powers in East Asia, the U.S., China, and Japan, it's better to be part of the 2 than the 1. So reaffirming the U.S.-Japan relationship would give us a positive position in the balance of power. But having said that, we said, let's try to extend the hand to China of inviting them into international trade and institutions. And we supported China's entry into the World Trade Organization and so forth. Alas, that didn't work. There are many arguments as to why that half of the policy didn't work. But one of them is after 2008, when the American created international financial crisis leads the Chinese to believe that the United States is in decline, they dropped Deng Xiaoping's policy of bide your time and become much more assertive. And when Xi Jinping comes to power in 2013, he becomes even more assertive. And so the Obama administration makes several efforts to try to work with the Chinese, but we know from internal Chinese documents, which we've seen since then, that the Chinese were planning on ways to reduce their dependence on the U.S. and to increase their diplomatic assertiveness. They called it wolf warrior diplomacy. And that means that by the time, even before Trump, by the end of the Obama administration in 2016, the relations between the U.S. and China are beginning to sour. So that leaves you with a picture that there are some islands of cooperation which work, but on the major relations between the U.S. and China and the U.S. and Russia, things look kind of bleak.
Okay. We are going to skip over, because I know there's going to be a lot of great questions. Read the book, and make sure also that you read Bound to Lead 1990 and recall the concept of soft power. But that's probably closer in memory. We'll get there in a little bit. This book also, I do want to touch on this, is very valuable because it's also a story about work, jobs, and a lot of hard work and doing different kinds of jobs in transits from academia to government and back. And I found that very insightful. Your reflections, and I guess some hard lessons about how the different environments require different skills and adjustments. And I just feel that might be an interesting place for us to wrap up this portion, since we're in a university and many people are probably considering similar pathways.
Well, there's a big difference between academic life and government, in the sense that in academic life, getting the answer just right is crucial, and time is secondary. So if you have to revise the article again and again and again, and it's published only 2 or 3 years later, nonetheless, if you get it to be an A+, you've made your reputation. If you publish it as an A-, people say, oh, it's okay, but. And also, while power is obviously part of academia, if you get your ideas just right, and people say, oh my God, I don't like that woman or that guy, but you can't ignore that article. I mean, she nailed it. If in government, it's very different. Timing is everything, and power is crucial. So you can have a great idea, but unless you can recruit other people to follow you, the idea doesn't have any political legs. It doesn't have any clout. And if you don't pay attention to time, it can be irrelevant. In other words, if I have to write a memo for the president about how we should handle the Russian ambassador who's coming in at 4 o'clock this afternoon, and I work on it, and I say, it's not quite right, I'm going to tweak it a little bit, and I get it over to the White House at 2:30, and it's too late to get through the paper process, so the memo doesn't get to the president in time for him to read it before the Russian ambassador comes in. It's not an A, it's an F for failure. And that's why there's a really big difference in basically how you organize your life in academia and how you organize it in government. On the other hand, I have found both absolutely fascinating. I mean, I'm glad to have done both, but I have to admit that they're very different types of games. You can take the ideas that you've developed in academia to inform what you do in government, and it gives you a sense of direction, which can sometimes help you accumulate power, because other people are, wanted. If you have a sense of purpose and a sense of direction, others may follow you. But you're spending political capital that you develop while you're in academia, and you just don't have time in government to develop really new ideas. Your life is dominated by your inbox. And or when I was in the Defense Department in '95, I visited 53 countries in 52 weeks. Well, it's hard to write a book on power and interdependence if you're on the airplane that much. Not to mention when you're back home testifying before congressional committees,
Right.
going to meetings in the Situation Room and so forth. So you spend down your intellectual capital that you build up. So there's a role for the inner and outer, as when you come back from government to academia, you have a sense of how government works, of what's practical, and you can convey that to your students. I mean, you can explain to them why an idea that looks good in this context may not work in another context. So there's there's a role, I think, for inners and outers, as Dick Neustadt called them, but it's also true that you got to realize that the two roles are when you're in and when you're out are quite different. You're going to have to play by slightly different rules
And develop different skills.
and develop different skills.
Yeah. Okay, so time actually is the theme. Unfortunately, we don't have very much. I'm not sure where my colleague with the mic is. Okay, so we're going to take two questions at once. We're going to start with Val and then come over here. So a brief question and end with a question mark, okay?
Wanted two questions, but okay. Thank you so much. Very, very thought-provoking, Professor Nye. The question of America's economic decline. You mentioned that probably it wasn't much of a decline, but maybe not an absolute decline, but certainly a relative economic decline relative to China. How serious do you see that? Yeah.
Okay, and then we're going to grab another question. So Madeline can come over here. Sorry.
Thank you. Don't you believe that some people cannot be, humanoids cannot be negotiated with? For example, Hitler, Putler. It doesn't matter what they sign. The next thing they can do, you can have not one treaty,
Okay.
you can have 74 treaties. They're never going to do anything different. So what's the point of signing or negotiating anything or having any treaties whatsoever?
Great, thank you.
Well, they're both good questions. On the question about decline, you're absolutely right. If I'd had time, I would have pointed out that not only is decline, there's a difference between absolute and relative decline, but if you look at relative decline, America, if China rises and the Americans stay the same, then that's decline relative to China. But the interesting thing is that China's increased share of world product has come at the expense of the other OECD countries, not at the expense of the United States. So China's risen relative to the United States, but the United States has kept its position relative to the world as a whole, which means that share that China has gained is they've eaten it from the Europeans and Japanese. So, but I'm glad you made the point because I should have made it. On the negotiations, you're right. There are some people with whom you basically can't trust them, and so if you think of a Hitler or a Stalin, after all, they signed the Hitler-Stalin Pact, which they violated, both of them. The question is, what's the role of negotiations? Negotiations may buy you a certain amount of time. It may eliminate certain areas of conflict. In other words, you say we're going to have conflict here, but not there. For example, the U.S. and the Soviets had an agreement on what they called incidents at sea, and the incidents at sea agreement said, okay, you're going to buzz our ships, we're going to buzz your ships, but neither of us is going to benefit if we wind up sinking a ship. Neither of us want that to happen. So here are some rules of the road to prevent that happening. And that actually worked. I mean, both because it was in the Soviet self-interest and in the American self-interest. So if you realize that with people who you don't trust, you've got to ask, what's the time horizon? If I can buy 6 months, is that worth it? And then and then the other dimension is scope. In other words, is this something which is narrow enough or precisely defined enough that I know it's in their self-interest to hold that, even if they don't hold the whole relationship. So be realistic about your negotiating partners, the answer to your question.
Okay, thank you very much. No, I'm sorry, we don't, we have so many people who want questions, but we will have some networking, so we'll go to Raul, and then maybe one, and then to Nam. So thank you very much, and we're going to have networking in a moment. So thank you. So Raul now is going to ask his question.
Very interesting contrast between getting something just right and having to have it just in time.
Yep.
There's a similar problem for diplomacy today of having open covenants that cannot be really openly arrived at when you have a 24/7 chattering class following your every move. Would you comment on the conduct of diplomacy today under the challenging conditions of 24/7 news cycles?
Okay,
Well,
so,
it's,
all right.
oh, sorry, you wanted to, yeah.
Yeah, so we'll just quickly go over to Nam. Nam Pham is right here. Oh, okay. Nam, we may be able to hear you, actually.
I have a big mouth. Dean, I was a student of yours, so if I may call you Dean. The just recently resigned FBI Director Christopher Wray said that, and he said more than once, China is the biggest threat to Western civilization. Do you agree with that assessment? And do you think that this century or next century can also be another American century?
Okay, two big questions.
Let me do the last one first. I think the danger with a policy toward China is either under or overestimating. In other words, if you look at the American power position vis-a-vis China, you have to realize that we don't have to rely on China's good intentions, because as I mentioned earlier, those intentions changed after they dropped Deng Xiaoping's policy. But the Chinese are practical. I mean, they are a rising power economically. They don't want to necessarily upset the apple cart. They benefit from that, and they're not about to overtake us in the sense that China is suffering from demographic decline. Its total factor productivity has been going down because you'd say, you know, machines are the way to replace the missing workers. Well, but the figures show that that's not producing extra productivity. The Chinese have a geographical problem, which is they have, you know, 6 or 7 geographical disputes with neighbors, where the Americans have, you know, 2 friendly neighbors and 2 big oceans. So there are a lot of reasons why the Americans shouldn't become too worried about China. But at the same time, they have to realize that under Xi Jinping, Chinese policy is not a policy of cooperation in the same sense that it was, let's say, under Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao. And I think that means that the dangers that we have in designing a policy are to avoid either over or underestimation of China. And so some of the rhetoric that sees China as, you know, an overwhelming threat, I think, is exaggerated. On the other hand, when the Pentagon says that China is the pacing challenge, that's not. I mean, that's a better way of putting it. Mm-hmm. And so it's, you know, trying to get that balance is difficult in Washington because you get political kudos if you are more alarmist, not if you're less so.
Okay, and then we had Raul's question.
Oh, remind me of, it was
Raul,
about...
yes.
Just right, just in time, 24/7 news cycle.
That's right, I got it, I remember it.
Openly arrived at.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, the modern news cycle and modern technology of the internet and social media makes diplomacy a lot harder. For example, when John F. Kennedy was managing the Cuban Missile Crisis, he did it over 13 days. And a lot of it was kept relatively quiet over those 13 days. It's very hard to see that today. It's not totally impossible. I mean, there have been some, I mentioned this case, it would be from the 70s, where we kept the French-Pakistan deal quiet for 3 months. But it's very hard today when things are placed on social media immediately, and there's so many different sources. So it makes diplomacy more difficult. And you then get into the questions of how do you use information in that kind of a world? And for example, the use of intelligence to change the news cycle becomes more important. I gave you a little example from my experience, but if you look at the question of Russian invasion of Ukraine, where our intelligence was very good about, we saw it coming. And William Burns, the head of the CIA, went to Moscow, talked to Putin, said, we know this, didn't dissuade Putin, but he also talked to the Allies, and they were more alert and more prepared, including the Ukrainians. So the use of information, and when do you make things public and when do you not, and what's the timing on that, becomes a lot trickier for diplomacy today than it was in the past.
Absolutely. Okay, so we owe a great debt of gratitude, but before we attempt to repay it, when we wrap up, I'm going to ask you all to stay seated, because we're going to go into the other room where we'll have refreshments and book sales. But let us get there, because there's so many good friends here. So we'll ask you to stay seated. Anyway, all of that said, please join me in thanking Dr. Joseph Nye.